Hi guy, tonight we're traveling back to a time before latex, before birth control pills, before Google searches asking what works and what definitely doesn't. Instead, imagine you're lying in a candlelit chamber of a medieval home, surrounded by flickering shadows, with the soft scent of herbs and... Wait, is that crocodile poop? Yes, it is. You're about to explore the murky, inventive, and borderline absurd world of medieval birth control. You probably won't survive this. Not because it's scary, but because you might just die laughing or cringing, or both. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know what part of the world you're falling asleep in tonight. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get going tonight. You're in Alexandria. It's warm, fragrant, and buzzing with life. A woman slips behind a curtain carrying a small clay bowl. She sits by a flickering oil lamp and unwraps a piece of wool soaked in a sweet, sticky substance. Honey mixed with crushed dates and a few other things you'd probably rather not ask about. She pushes it into place, hoping it will stop pregnancy the way one might try to stop a river with a sponge. Medieval contraception, you see, was often about blocking or confusing the body. The concept of sperm was foggy at best. Most people thought pregnancy came from a balance or imbalance of fluids, spirits, or seeds from both partners. So blocking the passage with something absorbent kind of made sense. If you squinted real hard and ignored basic anatomy. Let's talk about crocodile dung. Ancient Egyptians believed that placing dried crocodile poop in the vagina before sex could act as a contraceptive. The logic? Well, modern historians theorize it had something to do with the alkaline properties of the dung. That, and the sheer unpleasantness of the act, probably discouraged sex altogether. Effective? Technically. Enjoyable? Only if you're into smells that make your eyes water. Historians still debate whether these inserts worked because of chemical properties or just because couples avoided sex afterward due to, the smell of wild reptile waste. Also, the question of whether these methods were more ritualistic or genuinely believed to be effective is still wide open. Other concoctions included lint soaked in acacia gum, wool doused in various juices or honey, and even bread crusts. Yep, bread. Imagine going to a bakery and ordering one loaf, and can you leave the end bit dry for personal use? One story from the 12th century talks about women in Moorish Spain using tampons made from pounded pomegranate rind mixed with vinegar. Sounds tart. Definitely not FDA approved. But hey, when all you have is a mortar and pestle, you get creative. And there's a fun twist. These methods weren't always homemade. Some were sold in early pharmacies or by wise women. The medieval version of your eccentric aunt who sells essential oils and maybe also lives with 6 cats and a talking crow. If it smells funky and comes in a pouch tied with goat leather, it's probably contraceptive. Let's take a moment and honor the bravery it took to trust your reproductive health to animal dung and sour fruit. Here's your first light-hearted joke break. Imagine texting your medieval crush. Hey, want to come over? Sure, let me just insert my honeyed wool first. Romantic. Now let's not give too much credit to logic. While some ingredients may have had mild spermicidal properties like acacia or vinegar, others just had vibes. Good vibes, apparently. And in a time where people couldn't agree on whether sneezing could make you infertile, more on that later, vibes were pretty important. Now hold on to that thought, because even among these questionable methods, people were extremely private. There weren't public campaigns or pamphlets. Everything was passed down through whispers, coded recipes, and the trust of other women. Imagine learning about contraception not from a school nurse, but from your neighbor who swears by using goat bile mixed with nettle root under a full moon. In a monastery document from 14th century France, a scribe accidentally recorded a birth control remedy in the margins: goose fat and pepper placed inside a sheep bladder. Scholars believe it wasn't supposed to be copied into the manuscript. Just a note to self. But now you know what was circulating behind cloistered walls. And here's a fun, weird fact to whisper to your pillow tonight. Some women believe tying a small bag of crushed beetles around your ankle could stop pregnancy. Yes, beetles. As in, bugs. The reason? Some thought their tough shells symbolized fertility armor. Irony? Very possible. Science? Not so much. By now, you're probably wondering if anything actually worked. Well, researchers who've tried to recreate some of these mixtures in labs with far cleaner ingredients, don't worry, have found that certain herbs and materials might reduce sperm motility slightly. But the success rates? Wildly unreliable. Also, these methods often came with side effects. Infections, burns, allergic reactions, oh my. Let's just say you probably have better luck crossing your fingers, drinking wine, and hoping the moon was in the right phase. Which some people actually did. We'll get to that. Another academic debate? Whether some of these techniques were designed to be contraceptive at all, or whether they were more about health, pleasure, or even ritual purification. A honey and acacia mix might double as a mild antiseptic, so maybe the lines were blurrier than we think. You start to drift now. The idea of someone preparing a soft woolen tampon soaked in fruit juice feels oddly domestic, almost comforting in its routine, even if the ingredients make your nose crinkle. There's something soothing about the inventiveness, the desperation, the sheer let's try this and pray energy of it all. So next time you're annoyed that the pharmacy is out of your preferred brand, remember someone once crouched in a candlelit room stuffing animal intestines with acacia gum and crocodile crap just to not get pregnant. We stand on the shoulders of deeply confused, highly creative giants. And as you close your eyes tonight, remember this: crocodile poop, nature's weirdest mood killer. You move softly now through the incense-thick air of a medieval bedroom, or maybe a prayer chamber. It's hard to tell because back then, sex and spirituality weren't in separate boxes. In fact, they were often tangled up in the same tattered book of beliefs. And tonight, you're about to dive headfirst into the deeply weird world of amulets, prayers, and spells. Because what's birth control without a little superstition and Latin incantation? You're sitting cross-legged on a dusty floor. A woman in her 40s, wearing more scarves than strictly necessary, leans over you with a wooden charm. It's strung with bits of bone, herbs tied with red thread, and something suspiciously like dried tongue. She whispers a few words in an unrecognizable dialect and presses the charm to your stomach. Voila, pregnancy avoided, allegedly. Welcome to medieval magical contraception. In a time when medicine involved more guesswork than science, a lot of people believed that fertility could be influenced by the spiritual world. If you could bless a cow or curse your neighbor's barley harvest, why not cast a spell on your uterus? So let's begin with amulets. One popular talisman was made from weasel testicles. Yep, dried, strung together, and worn on a necklace. The idea was that weasels could reproduce without intercourse. Not true, by the way. So wearing their anatomy might pass on that miraculous ability, or at least confuse your ovaries into staying quiet. Historians still debate whether these charms were meant literally or symbolically. Was the weasel necklace supposed to channel anti-fertility energy, or was it just a weird form of magical placebo? No one's totally sure, but the fun doesn't stop with jewelry. Another bizarre method was the magic word prayer spell. Women would repeat protective verses while tying knots in a cord, then wear it around their waist during sex. One recorded phrase translated to, bind the door, seal the womb, protect the seed. A bit dramatic, but poetic, right? In Anglo-Saxon England, you might have found a woman standing barefoot in a field at dawn, chanting to the sun and rubbing ash on her belly. According to one surviving text, this would banish the child seed from entering, because apparently the sun had other plans for your uterus. The church, as you might expect, was not thrilled about this, but it was also part of the problem. Clerics often walked a weird line, condemning magic while simultaneously writing prayers that sounded an awful lot like spells. One authorized birth control prayer was meant to be said over a piece of bread, which the woman would then eat. Delicious contraception. Please don't try this at home. Meanwhile, in medieval Germany, people would write protective verses on parchment, then roll them up and insert them into, well, you can probably guess. Not exactly the kind of scrolls you keep in the family library. Let's pause for joke number one. If medieval contraception was sold today, it would come in a suspicious Etsy package labeled anti-baby vibes, weasel tested, witch approved. Some spells required timing. A woman might carry out rituals during a full moon or when Saturn was rising in a specific constellation, because obviously your birth control depends on where a giant gas planet is floating in the sky. And speaking of the moon, women were told to avoid intercourse when it was too full, lest it make the baby grow horns. Totally normal bedtime advice. Odd fact break. In medieval Serbia, one method involved writing the name of an enemy on a chicken bone, burning it at a crossroads, and urinating on the ashes. This would allegedly curse your womb with barrenness, only until you undid the spell. So, flexible magic, I guess. Back in France, a spellbook called the Picatrix advised tying a piece of deer skin inscribed with magical symbols around your thigh before intercourse. Bonus points if it was bathed in oil made from owl feathers and menstrual blood, which is one of those moments where you hope no one ever walks in on you prepping for date night. Here's a charming academic debate for your dreams. Some scholars argue that many of these rituals were more about female empowerment than actual birth control. They gave women control over their bodies in a world where that was rare. Others insist these were desperate attempts by women who had no better options and were willing to try anything short of jumping into the sea. You drift slightly now, lulled by the idea of secret chants and protective symbols. It's comforting, in a weird way, to think that someone cared enough to write out a spell and hope it would work, no matter how bizarre it sounds now. In their minds, these charms were armor, and magic was science's awkward, slightly stoned cousin. You pass through a room where herbs hang from the ceiling. A woman stirs a bowl of crushed mint, yarrow, and lavender. She dips a strip of linen into the mix and mutters something about closing the door between worlds. She's serious, and maybe just a little sleep-deprived. Here's joke number 2. If you think modern dating is confusing, imagine asking someone, "So are you seeing anyone?" "Yeah, me and my anti-pregnancy amulet are exclusive." Some birth control spells were built into everyday objects, embroidered into dresses, woven into belts, or scratched onto wooden combs. The idea was to surround yourself with symbols that whispered "no babies thanks" into the void. There were also reverse spells, used when contraception had accidentally worked too well. One curious text describes how to unbind the womb by soaking your hands in goat's milk, singing a lullaby backwards, and then sneezing. Don't ask, just don't. The line between faith and fear was razor thin. Women often combined Christian prayers with folk remedies. One English charm mixed Bible verses with a chant to the goddess Freya, an odd combo, like praying to Jesus with a Norse sidekick. And men? They weren't completely off the hook. Some wore amulets too, tiny carvings of roosters, snakes, or even little wooden swords. Supposedly these protected the seed, though let's be honest, wearing a tiny rooster around your neck is just begging for mockery. Joke number 3. If medieval guys had Tinder bios, it would read knight, poet, seed-protecting rooster enthusiast. The deeper you wander, the clearer it becomes that this wasn't just about preventing pregnancy. It was about mystery, about control, about doing something in a world where science hadn't shown up yet with diagrams and pamphlets. You curl up now in your soft dream, surrounded by the whisper of parchment, the glow of candlelight, and the distant echo of chants sung by women who just didn't want more children, or who wanted the choice, even if that choice came wrapped in owl feathers and deer hide. Sleep tight, friend. May your dreams be weasel-free. You're floating now, deeper into the past where the line between medicine and magic grows blurrier with each step. You're in a place where physicians wear long robes, not for ceremony, but to hide the fact that most of their treatments involve either burning something or putting it in an orifice it clearly doesn't belong in. Tonight's lesson? Medieval medicine, especially the odd-god gynecological advice given by early doctors who were just barely qualified to remove a splinter, let alone handle contraception. You're lying on a rickety examination table, if you can call a wobbly plank a table, and across from you stands a man with ink-stained fingers and an expression that screams, "I read a book once." This is your local medical authority, and he's about to suggest something unforgettable. "Insert roasted ant brains and wine into the womb," he says calmly, "and repeat after intercourse for best results." Nope, you're not dreaming. That's actually a historical recommendation. Welcome to medieval medical contraception, where ingredients were weird, tools were terrifying, and the confidence to competence ratio was impressively skewed. Let's start with De Secretis Mulierum, The Secrets of Women. A wildly popular 13th century text written under the name of Albertus Magnus, though historians still debate whether he actually wrote it. This book claimed to reveal all the mysteries of the female body, including how to stop pregnancy. One suggestion: drink a potion made of ground earthworms and crushed pearls during menstruation. And if that doesn't work, try leeches. Yes, again, see, medieval medicine loved leeches for everything. Flu, leeches. Back pain, leeches. Want to avoid pregnancy? Pop one on your thigh and chant a psalm. Which psalm? Dealer's choice. Now, for the record, some of these remedies weren't completely off base. One recurring ingredient was Queen Anne's lace, a wild carrot. Surprisingly, modern science has found it may actually have some anti-fertility properties. But did people use it properly? Almost never. One old recipe called for women to chew the seeds and whisper a secret to the moon. Not quite how enzymes work. Here's joke number one. If medieval doctors had Yelp reviews, showed up for a cough, left with hot wine and a weasel skull in my shoe. Now let's talk about the big three categories of medieval contraceptive potions. 1. Purging mixtures, herbs and minerals that caused vomiting, diarrhea, or flushing of the womb. 2. Womb cooling tonics, based on the theory that pregnancy was caused by heat in the uterus. Cool it down, stop conception. Simple-ish. Binding powders meant to close the womb physically or spiritually. In category 1, you've got wild substances like pennyroyal, savin, and hellebore, all toxic. Very effective at messing up your body, possibly your life. Did it stop pregnancy? Sometimes. Did it stop you altogether? Yeah, also sometimes. Category 2 brings us to cooling agents. Lettuce juice, vinegar, crushed marble, and something called milk of the poppy, a sort of DIY opium. Doctors would prescribe cold compresses to the abdomen, sometimes made of frogs, sometimes of wine-soaked cloth. Historians still debate whether this was meant as serious science or just desperate guessing. Imagine you're a medieval woman asking, "How do I not get pregnant?" And your doctor replies, "Try pressing this frog to your navel. It's been in the fridge." Now category 3, the powders. You'd grind animal bones, sometimes mouse skulls or bat wings, into a fine dust, then mix it with honey and apply, well, you know where. This was said to bind the womb shut. Makes sense if you've never had a biology class and think the uterus has a drawstring. Here's a legit weird fact. A 14th century Italian manuscript recommended wearing the left testicle of a male weasel in a small pouch tied to your right thigh to reverse fertility for 7 days. 7 days, not 6, not 8. Very specific magic window. Now we take a quick turn into the world of diagnostic advice, basically how doctors tested a woman's fertility. One common method involved putting garlic into the vagina overnight and checking her breath in the morning. If her mouth smelled like garlic, it meant her womb was open because, you know, everything's connected in there like a long hallway, apparently. Joke number 2. If your medieval gynecologist starts checking your breath to diagnose your womb, it's time to request a second opinion, or a time machine. Some women preferred powders made with crushed gemstones, pearls, garnets, or moonstone, ground up and added to food. Supposedly, these minerals would block the passage of life. Spoiler alert, they probably just chipped your teeth and gave you expensive constipation. And then there were the wines, because of course there were. Doctors loved prescribing infused wines, rosemary and vinegar wine, nettle and ash wine, or in one 10th century Irish remedy, wine boiled with boiled bones of the barren cow. That last one was meant to make your womb forget how to conceive. Talk about gaslighting your uterus. Now imagine you're a nun in the 1300s, secretly brewing these wines in your herbal garden. You're not just praying, you're pouring, and maybe whispering a Latin blessing over the bubbling mix, because even the convents weren't completely celibate in practice, especially in remote monasteries with no oversight. Another bizarre and probably painful technique? Applying crushed leeches, yes, again with the leeches, directly to the inner thigh or pubic area. The theory, the bites would cause enough swelling or discomfort to prevent intercourse. Not pregnancy, just discourage sex. Passive-aggressive contraception. You find yourself now in a tiled apothecary. Jars line the walls, dried lizard tails, pressed herbs, even powdered horn. The doctor dips a long spoon into a mixture labeled serpent salt. It smells like burnt sage and regret. Let's not forget the herbal pessaries, basically early suppositories. These were made from mixtures of myrrh, aloe, cedar oil, and other ingredients, stuffed into linen or wool and inserted before intercourse. Some actually had mild antimicrobial effects. Others, total chaos, burning, itching, irritation. You'd think someone would say, maybe we don't put cedar oil in there, but alas, pain was part of the process. Here's joke number 3. Medieval medical motto, if it stings, it's working. You drift again, through dry gardens where women dry roots in the sun, into cold stone kitchens where potions are stirred with spoons carved from bone, through quiet rooms where a woman mutters the same recipe her grandmother whispered to her, half believing it still works. It's all connected. Science, magic, desperation, hope. Medieval women didn't have pamphlets or YouTube tutorials. They had bat powder and garlic breath. But through all the strangeness, one thing stands out. They tried. Again and again. Across centuries and cultures, they kept searching for a little more control, a little more say in the matter. So tonight, sleep knowing that you come from a long line of quietly defiant people. People who believed that crocodile poop, ant brains, and poppy wine were worth a shot. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't entirely wrong. You're drifting now into a different sort of room. Not a dusty apothecary, not a moonlit field of whispered spells, but something colder, more clinical. A place where rules are written down with ink and iron, and failure isn't just inconvenient, it's criminal. Tonight, you're walking into the world of medieval legal and religious punishment for contraception. A place where getting caught trying not to get pregnant could land you in prison, or worse, on the bad side of the church. You push open a heavy wooden door and step into a dim chamber. A scribe looks up, eyes narrowed. He's been copying the same line of canon law for the last 6 hours, and your presence is already a disturbance. But you don't care, because you're here to understand what it meant, truly meant, for contraception to be considered sinful. You see, in the medieval Christian world, sex was supposed to be for one thing and one thing only: making babies. Anything else? Suspicious, possibly heretical, definitely worth a nasty sermon or two. Let's get the big players straight. The Catholic Church dominated the spiritual life of most of Europe in the Middle Ages, and its official position was that using contraception, any form of it, was a violation of natural law. That's right, not just church law, nature itself. One 13th century theologian, Thomas Aquinas, called contraception a worse sin than incest or rape. Historians still debate whether this was a rhetorical exaggeration or a literal hierarchy, but either way, yikes. The logic was this: sex is only morally acceptable if it's open to procreation. So if you block pregnancy on purpose, you're not just breaking a rule, you're messing with divine design. And medieval folks did not take that lightly. Here's joke number 1. Imagine confessing in a medieval church. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." What did you do? "I didn't get pregnant." Gasp. Unthinkable. Punishments varied wildly depending on who you were. A poor peasant woman might be publicly whipped or forced to perform penance, like walking barefoot to church every Sunday for a year. A noble woman, though, she might get off with just a private scolding, assuming she made a sizable donation to the church roof fund. But if you were an herbalist or midwife caught distributing contraceptives, that's where things got dark. You could be labeled a witch. That word didn't always mean pointy hat and broomstick. In medieval Europe, it often meant a woman who had knowledge others didn't, especially medical knowledge, especially anything related to fertility. One infamous case involved a midwife in 14th century Germany who was executed for conspiring to prevent births. She'd been giving women mixtures of pennyroyal and mugwort, common abortifacients at the time. The court claimed she was working against the will of God. Now you're walking past stone walls covered in faded parchments, legal documents, edicts. One reads, "Any woman found guilty of blocking conception shall fast 40 days and be beaten with rods by her husband." Charming. Even Islamic scholars in the medieval world, who were generally more tolerant of contraception than Christian theologians, debated the ethics of it. Some approved methods like coitus interruptus, L, as long as both partners agreed. Others argued it was morally dangerous to interfere with divine will. In Jewish medieval texts, the conversation was different still. Some rabbinic authorities allowed contraception in certain situations, especially if childbirth would be life-threatening. But they too warned against wasting seed, which was considered a grave offense. So, the religious world wasn't completely monolithic, but one message was consistent. Contraception wasn't just a private choice. It was a spiritual decision with cosmic consequences. You find yourself now in the chambers of the Inquisition. Those fun folks who made sure heresy stayed punished. And guess what? Using contraception, especially through magical means, could absolutely be labeled heretical. If you were caught with protective amulets, or found scribbling a suspicious Latin verse on a strip of linen, it might not be interpreted as harmless folk medicine. It might be proof you'd made a pact with the devil. One woman in 15th century Spain was accused of closing her womb with demonic words. She was imprisoned and later vanished from the records. Never a good sign. Here's a legitimate odd fact. In some medieval French towns, municipal laws actually prohibited the sale of sterile herbs in marketplaces. Sellers had to prove the purpose of their wares wasn't to prevent God's harvest. And if caught, shaming, banishment. It gets even weirder. Some laws punished the male partners of contraceptive users too, especially if they were seen as encouraging the practice. That's right. If your husband supported your womb's right to remain empty, he could also be fined or whipped. Joke number 2, equal opportunity oppression, where both you and your boyfriend get in trouble for buying parsley. Now, lest you think this only applied to normal people, think again. Even nuns weren't spared from scrutiny. Some convents were suspected of suppressing fertility through unnatural methods. A poetic way of saying, we're suspicious that Sister Agnes isn't entirely celibate, which led to some extremely awkward church audits. Meanwhile, midwives, already under suspicion for assisting births, were often blamed when women stopped conceiving. Not because of any evidence, of course, but because they were the ones who knew what herbs to whisper into the pot. You're seated now in a courtroom, not a modern one with microphones and wigs. No, this one smells like damp wood and burning tallow. A bishop raises a quill and asks a trembling woman if she's ever spoken the name of Saint Margaret while boiling wine. She says yes. He frowns. That was a common sin, invoking saints in ritual contraception. Saint Margaret was the patron of childbirth, but also sometimes used in prayers meant to prevent it. Tricky theological ground. Historians still debate whether these women genuinely believed in their methods or simply hoped. Hoped the saints wouldn't mind too much. Hoped the punishment wouldn't come. Hoped no one noticed they were bleeding a little longer this month than usual. Now here's joke number 3. Medieval contraception was like a high-stakes escape room. Find the herb, say the prayer, don't get caught, and hope the moon isn't in the wrong phase. You stumble out of the legal hall, breath caught in your throat, head spinning from Latin and logic. And yet, beneath all the rules and the punishments in the Psalms, there's something more human: desperation. People were trying to control their lives in a time that didn't want them to have any control at all. A poor woman couldn't afford another child. A nun had broken her vows in a moment of weakness. A married couple wanted to love each other without consequence. They weren't villains. They were just people. People who boiled roots in secret, who whispered to saints in hope for mercy, who risked public shame for a little private freedom. So as you drift further into your blanket, remember this. The rules may have been written in iron, but the hearts behind them, flesh and blood, hopeful, fallible, brave. You're stepping into the cool shadow of a crumbling abbey now. The grass is high and soft beneath your feet, the wind carrying the faintest smell of rosemary and something else. Burnt parchment, maybe? You're not here for worship. Not really. You're here because this place used to hold secrets. Quiet ones. The kind whispered between women, passed on like old recipes and coded glances. Tonight, you're entering the world of monastic contraceptive experiments. Yes, monks and nuns who dabbled in fertility control behind cloistered walls. Because chastity, as it turns out, was sometimes more of an ideal than a reality. And even in places devoted to God, the human body had other ideas. Let's start with a fact that might surprise you. Not all monasteries were fully celibate. Especially in the early Middle Ages, monastic rules were a little flexible. Nuns might take vows, but enforcement varied wildly. Some orders were strict, others more lenient, especially in rural areas or smaller convents with no formal oversight. So what happens when someone inside the cloister finds herself in trouble? She experiments. Historical records, what little survives, hint at a hidden world of herbal lore behind monastery walls. In garden records from 12th century Germany, we find repeated mentions of silphium, wild carrot, and rue, all plants associated with early contraceptive properties. Now officially, they were grown for stomach ailments, but every nun with a garden knows that stomach ailments can mean a lot of things. Here's joke number 1. Stomach ache in a monastery? Translation: help, I made a vow of celibacy, but Brother Paul has really nice shoulders. Some convent apothecaries were practically laboratories. Recipes were written in code, or as remedies for regulating the female cycle, a nice way of saying birth control without getting excommunicated. A 13th century manuscript from an Italian abbey includes instructions for making a tincture of fennel, rue, and wormwood, boiled in wine and steeped for 3 days. The label says it soothes the womb and wards off unclean seed. A delicate euphemism if there ever was one. Now historians still debate whether these remedies were used preventively or after the fact. Were the sisters trying not to get pregnant or quietly ending pregnancies that had already begun? The truth is probably both. You slip through the back door of the abbey kitchen. Inside, a nun stirs a pot of something thick and bitter smelling. She glances over her shoulder before dropping in a bundle of dried flowers. Then she prays, not loudly, but under her breath. It's not blasphemy, it's survival. Convents were often the only spaces where women had autonomy, where they could learn medicine, grow herbs, keep records. And with that came knowledge. Real knowledge. Not just folk magic, but precise measurements, timing, cause and effect. You open a cupboard and find linen packets, each tied with red thread. Inside, dried herbs rolled into pessaries, primitive suppositories meant to be inserted before sex. The record calls them blessings of Saint Bridget. That's right. Some nuns attributed contraceptive methods to saints, especially female saints who were rumored to have refused motherhood. Saint Bridget of Ireland, for instance, was said to have blessed a woman's womb shut so she could remain a virgin. Interpret that how you will. Now here's your legitimate odd fact. One medieval Irish text claims that Saint Bridget performed the first recorded abortion in Christian legend, blessing away a nun's unwanted pregnancy with a single prayer. It wasn't condemned. It was celebrated. That's the thing. These stories weren't always hush-hush. In some religious communities, women helping each other with fertility were seen as protectors, not sinners. The rules weren't always enforced the same way. Interpretation was everything. You cross into the scriptorium now, a room of scribes copying books by hand, eyes straining in candlelight. One sister is bent over a medical manual, her margins filled with annotations. Scribbled notes in Latin translate roughly to, "Do not use during holy days, may cause cramping." She's not copying this for fun. She's preserving something. Some of the most advanced gynecological knowledge of the Middle Ages came from nuns. They studied works by ancient Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, but adapted them. They kept logs. They recorded outcomes. They treated other women with gentleness because they actually understood what it meant to be afraid of pregnancy in a world where childbirth was a coin toss. Joke number 2. Forget Hogwarts. Medieval nunneries were the real schools of potions and defense against the dark arts, aka men with no self-control. Let's pause and picture it. A cloister garden under moonlight, rows of herbs, soft chanting, 2 women kneeling near a patch of rue, fingers dusted with pollen. They don't call it birth control. They don't have to. They just know. But not all monastic experiments were herbal. Some involved timing. Nuns noticed that women seemed less likely to conceive at certain points in their cycle, well before modern science confirmed the fertility window. So they advised spacing intercourse accordingly. Again, this had to be coded. Abstain on days of heat, or fast from flesh when the moon is thin. Historians still debate how accurate this advice was. Probably hit or miss, but it showed awareness, a desire to understand and control what was otherwise left to fate. You flip through a crumbling ledger and find a list of prohibited rituals. Next to dancing on feast days and humming secular melodies, there's this: washing with cold wine and willow bark before sleeping. Doesn't sound like a big deal, right? But it was a known contraceptive wash in folk medicine. The abbey knew what was happening, and someone tried to stop it. Here's joke number 3. When your nightly skincare routine doubles as secret contraception, medieval multitasking at its finest, you linger a while longer among the quiet echoes of whispered prayers and rustling veils. The more you look, the more you realize monasteries weren't just holy places. They were safe houses, laboratories, libraries of forbidden knowledge. And the women inside, they were scientists, herbalists, even rebels, not with swords or scrolls, but with rosemary and timing charts. They knew the risks, they knew the rules, but they also knew each other. And that knowledge, shared quietly in candlelight, became power. So as you fall deeper into stillness, remember this: behind every garden wall, every cloistered gate, every faded recipe in Latin, there was someone like you. Someone who just wanted a little more control, a little more say in their own story. The air shifts as you leave the cloister behind. It's heavier now, sticky with incense and the scent of too many bodies packed into too little space. You're walking through a bustling medieval city where the streets are loud with markets, gossip, and the clatter of carts. But you're not here for bread or shoes or a good wool cloak. You're looking for something harder to find: contraceptives sold by traveling merchants, charlatans, and wise women at the margins of the marketplace. Because in the alleys behind the butchers and bakers, people whispered about other kinds of remedies, things you couldn't ask for out loud, things wrapped in cloth, passed hand to hand under the table, paid for in silence. You slip into a shadowed corner of the market and find her, an old woman with sharp eyes and fingers stained green from grinding herbs. She doesn't speak right away, just gestures for you to sit. Then she opens a pouch and pulls out something that looks like dried moss. It smells aggressive. You're about to learn the fine art of medieval street contraception, a chaotic mix of tradition, superstition, desperate experimentation, and very questionable hygiene. One of the most commonly sold substances in these back corners? Pennyroyal. Yep, the same herb used in teas today was once sold in potent, bitter concentrates as a womb cleanser. A few drops in wine, and supposedly, your pregnancy problem was solved. Only problem? It was also highly toxic. Take too much and your liver gives out. Take too little and, well, no change. Historians still debate how effective pennyroyal really was. Some say it caused miscarriages. Others argue that its danger outweighed its usefulness, and that most women relied more on combinations than single herbs. Odd fact time. In some parts of medieval England, pennyroyal was called run by the wall, a name that reflected its association with unmarried women fleeing unexpected consequences. Poetic, huh? Here's joke number 1. If your potion has a nickname like run by the wall, maybe reconsider your birth plan. But pennyroyal wasn't the only thing sold in secret. Some vendors peddled small wax figurines known as child binders. They were worn around the waist or neck and were supposed to spiritually prevent conception, sort of like a medieval IUD, but held together with prayer and hope. Others sold charm papers, tiny scrolls of Latin incantations or Hebrew letters folded into amulets. Women would wear them inside their clothing or sew them into the lining of their dresses. And you better believe these weren't sold out in the open. No, they were slipped to you between 2 slices of bread or wrapped inside a fish skin. You're walking past stalls now, and a merchant with too many rings on his fingers is whispering, "Protection for lovers, womb-safe oil, St. Anne's blessing in a bottle." He winks. You don't wink back, but you do take the bottle. It's labeled in bad Latin, something about saffron, vinegar, and boiled goat bladder. And that's when it hits you. People would literally try anything. Vinegar was a big one. Women were instructed to soak sponges or cloths in vinegar or lemon juice and insert them before intercourse. The theory was that acidity killed sperm. Science eventually confirmed this has a tiny bit of merit, but not enough to justify the risk of, burning yourself from the inside out. And then there was beaver testicle tea. Yes, you read that right. Some traveling salesmen sold dried beaver testicles, sometimes powdered, sometimes just mummified looking, to be steeped in warm water and consumed weekly. It was supposed to cool the seed and close the womb. And people bought it. Because when your options are drink this or have a 13th child, beaver bits start sounding pretty appealing. Joke number 2. Nothing says romantic evening like a cup of hot testicle broth. Love is in the air. You duck into a smaller alley and find a clothier selling more than linen. Hidden in her stockpile are womb rings, soft bands of wool soaked in herbal mixtures and shaped to fit inside the body. These were predecessors to the cervical cap, and some were even designed with strings so they could be removed later. Sound familiar? It should. Innovation doesn't always need a lab coat. Now, it wasn't just women buying these things. Men came too. Husbands, lovers, even monks on errands for a sick aunt. They asked carefully, never directly. Anything for preventing complications. The vendors knew what they meant. Everyone knew. Still, not all sellers were benevolent helpers. Some were straight-up con artists. They sold snake oil labeled "Womb Be Gone" or hawked lead pellets as God's seed stones. They'd guarantee results. Take your coin and vanish by morning. One 14th century record describes a man who sold boiled acorns in wine as the safest childless potion under heaven. The customer returned a month later, very much still pregnant, and chased him through the streets with a cooking pan. Joke number 3. Guaranteed pregnancy prevention or your fetus back. Said no medieval merchant ever. You settle on a low stone wall beside a basket of garlic and leeks. Next to you, a young woman is counting coins nervously. She glances up, meets your eyes, and gives a tiny nod. She's been here before. She knows who to ask, what to say, when to stay quiet. You realize that contraception wasn't just a science back then. It was as a network, a code, a shared survival guide written in herbs, whispers, and trusted hands. Women passed recipes and lullabies. Mothers taught daughters which herbs to chew, which prayers to murmur. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about choice, even if that choice came wrapped in goatskin and tasted like old vinegar. Let's pause here for a moment. Historians still debate how widespread these practices really were. Did most people in medieval cities use them, or just a handful of desperate souls? We'll never know for sure. The records are patchy, the story's incomplete, but we do know this: the demand was constant. No matter the place, Florence, Paris, London, Damascus, there were always people seeking control over their bodies, always someone willing to sell a scrap of knowledge, always someone willing to risk it all for a little space to breathe. And in these marketplace shadows, under the thick smells of fish and wax, the fight for bodily autonomy kept going. Quiet, determined, unstoppable. You stand now, brushing the dust from your cloak. The sun is dipping low behind the towers of the city, casting long golden shadows across the square. Somewhere someone is stirring rue into wine. Someone else is praying over a linen packet. And another woman, like you, is watching, learning, waiting for the moment she'll need that knowledge. Because even when laws forbade it, when pulpits condemned it, when doctors denied it, women found a way. They always do. Sky grows darker now as you leave the city walls behind. You're headed into the countryside. Wide fields, quiet forests, crooked little villages where nobody trusts outsiders and secrets grow like weeds. Out here, the rules are looser. Church officials don't visit as often, and the law is more suggestion than command. You're walking into the realm of folk contraception, where knowledge is old, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, and shock, everything you need grows in the garden or the woods. Your boots crunch over gravel. A lantern flickers in the window of a small thatched cottage, and the smell of something bitter floats through the night air. Rosemary? Mugwort? You're not sure, but it makes your nose itch. This is where the real witchy stuff lives. The kind of contraception you'll never find in books, because it wasn't meant for books. It was meant for survival. You knock, and a stooped old woman opens the door. Her apron is dusted with ash. Her hands are black with soil. She doesn't say much, just nods for you to come in. Inside, the room is warm, cluttered, and vaguely chaotic. Herbs hang from every beam. Dried flowers spill from cracked bowls. Animal skulls line the top of the hearth. You sit, and she begins. Tonight, you're learning about the strangest, wildest, and most persistent contraceptive traditions from the rural medieval world. Let's begin with the classic, weasel testicles. Yes, really. Some women believe that carrying a dried weasel's testicle in a small cloth bag around their thigh would prevent pregnancy. This was especially common in parts of Eastern Europe. It wasn't inserted or ingested, just worn, like a cursed friendship bracelet. Odd fact time. In a few German folk tales, the weasel testicle amulet was thought to work better if it was taken from a live weasel, which raises a lot of comfortable questions about how exactly that was accomplished. And now, your first joke, weasel testicles, because nothing says I'm not ready for a baby like risking rabies for fashion. Moving on. In the British Isles, women used ferns. Specifically, the spores of male ferns were believed to dry the womb and close the seed gate. They'd either drink the spores in a tea, mix them with ale, or crush them into honey. Unfortunately, ferns are also mildly toxic in large doses, so while you might not get pregnant, you might also spend a week vomiting in a field. There were even ritual baths. In some parts of medieval France, women bathed in cold water steeped with juniper and ash bark immediately after sex. The shock of the temperature, plus the properties of the herbs, was thought to flush out any lingering seed. Effective? Probably not. Freezing? Definitely. Here's joke number 2, because nothing gets you in the mood quite like thinking, guess I'll be bathing in bark water later. Now, in the Slavic regions, we find something extra strange. The use of bread dough pessaries. Women shaped small plugs of raw bread dough, often mixed with garlic or onion juice, and inserted them like sponges. These acted as both a barrier and, supposedly, a sperm repellent. Sounds ridiculous, but hey, it's basically gluten-based birth control. Historians still debate whether this was even remotely effective. Some argue the acidity of the garlic helped, while others say it probably just led to yeast infections. The historical record is mostly just confused. And then there's crocodile dung. Oh yeah, remember this classic? In Egypt, and weirdly, in a few translated Greek texts passed around Europe, it was believed that inserting dried crocodile dung mixed with honey and lint could block conception. Now, Europe didn't exactly have crocodiles, but the idea somehow migrated anyway. Some enterprising apothecaries even sold imported dung for this very purpose. Of course, crocodile dung wasn't easy to get, so in places like Spain and Italy, women substituted donkey dung instead, a local, affordable option. And if that makes you want to gag, congratulations, you're sane. Joke number 3. When the birth control aisle is just herbs, vinegar, or poop, it really makes you appreciate modern science. In some parts of Scandinavia, women relied on ritual gestures. One such tradition involved jumping backwards 7 times after intercourse, while holding a sprig of yarrow between their teeth, and repeating the name of a local river. If you think that sounds absurd, remember, sometimes belief is more powerful than biology. Folk remedies weren't always about plants or materials. Sometimes they were pure superstition. For instance, some women believed tying a string made of deer sinew around the left ankle would prevent pregnancy as long as it wasn't removed. Others placed stones under their pillows, engraved with runes of protection, or carried carved wooden eggs as fertility warders. And then there were prayers, not the ones from the pulpit, personal ones, secret ones, passed along with lullabies and bedtime stories. A woman might whisper to Saint Margaret, the protector of pregnant women, asking her to close the womb just a little longer, or invoke old pagan spirits disguised as saints to do the same. You sit by the hearth now, watching as the old woman grinds something into a dark paste. She doesn't explain it, but you know it's not for cooking. She pours it into a small jar and corks it tightly. Then she hands it to you. No label, no instructions, just trust. That's how this world works. Quiet trust among those with no other options. Historians still debate whether these traditions were based on observation or desperation. Some remedies appear in multiple regions, which suggests some effectiveness. Others are likely nonsense, born from fear and a need for control in a world that offered none. But one thing's for sure, rural women didn't sit back and wait. They acted, they experimented, they adapted. They used what they had, plants, animals, gestures, rituals, stories, and the knowledge survived. Not in universities, but in gardens and kitchens and bedtime rhymes. You step outside in the cool air again. The sky is full of stars now, bright and wild, like a warning or a blessing. The woman stands in the doorway, watching you go. She doesn't wave, but she nods, just once. You'll remember that nod. You'll remember what she gave you. Because out here in the middle of nowhere, people have been figuring out how to shape their futures for centuries, with or without permission. And some of their answers were very, very weird. You walk away from the cottage, the countryside wrapped in shadow and silence, with the stars freckling the sky above you like some kind of divine Morse code. The path winds downhill toward a distant village, your mind still heavy with garlic-scented pessaries and angry weasels. You thought you'd heard it all by now, but the medieval world still has a few tricks left. Because tonight, you're heading into a place where contraception got accidentally advanced and deeply, deeply weird. The monasteries. Yep, you think monks and nuns would be the last people interested in reproductive health. I mean, celibacy is kind of their whole deal. But history's rarely that tidy. Behind abbey walls and illuminated manuscripts, you'll find people studying fertility, testing medical theories, and sometimes, yes, getting secretly busy. Let's set the scene. You've crept into the scriptorium, where a pale monk is hunched over a thick book, scratching symbols onto vellum. On the surface, it looks like a list of saints or herbal remedies, but as your eyes adjust, you notice a pattern. Certain plants are circled, others have side notes in red ink. One entry reads, "To prevent the seed from quickening." What you found is a cloistered contraceptive cheat sheet. Because despite their vows, many monks and nuns were scholars. And scholarly minds tend to wander, especially when copying ancient Greek or Arabic texts that talk candidly about sex, anatomy, and reproduction. So did monks and nuns know about birth control? Yes, often more than anyone else. One common method written into monastic herbals was the use of wild carrot seed, also known as Queen Anne's lace. When taken shortly after intercourse, it was believed to disrupt implantation. Modern science has actually backed this up. Wild carrot seed can interfere with progesterone in some animals. Though dosing was unreliable, it had enough real effect that some modern herbalists still caution against its casual use. Odd fact time. Some manuscripts refer to wild carrot as the chaste root, which is hilarious because people used it mostly to avoid the side effects of unchastity. Joke number 1. Calling a contraceptive the chaste root is like calling a fire extinguisher the cozy flame enhancer. But back to the monks. They copied texts from the Islamic world, where medicine was more advanced and often more explicit. The writings of Avicenna, for example, detailed various contraceptive herbs and even described timing intercourse based on moon phases to prevent conception. These weren't just curiosities, they were studied, sometimes adapted, occasionally tested. Some monks wrote anonymously about mixtures of acacia, wine, and honey used as suppositories. Others described oil of rue to be applied with cloth before bed. Occasionally, the monks got bold and penned letters under pseudonyms asking, say, whether wearing dried mint around one's loins might block fertility. Spoiler, no, but points for creativity. In one particularly strange case from the 12th century, a nun was caught brewing a moon tea made of wormwood and juniper. She claimed it was for digestive spirits, but the local bishop suspected otherwise. Historians still debate whether she was concocting a love potion or a contraceptive. Either way, she was transferred to a stricter abbey where the only herbs allowed were for soup. You walk now past the abbey's garden, where fennel, parsley, mugwort, and mint grow in neat rows. These weren't just for flavor, they were staples of monastic medicine, used to regulate menstruation, cool the humors, and yes, reduce conception. Mugwort especially was the star of the show. Called motherwort in some texts, it was brewed into dark teas said to prevent pregnancy when taken regularly. The taste? Like boiled sadness, but women and monks drank it anyway. Joke number 2. If your morning tea tastes like regret and bark, you're either very committed to your goals or a monk with boundary issues. Now, of course, monks weren't supposed to be out there testing this stuff on themselves, and many weren't. But their access to medical texts made them invaluable to the women who lived nearby. Peasant women would sometimes sneak into monasteries, pretending to sell cheese or eggs just to ask a question. What herb softens the wound? What bark ends the bleed? The monks couldn't answer outright, but they gesture to a page or slip a dried bundle into the basket. Some monasteries even ran infirmaries where midwives worked quietly under clerical supervision. The official stance was medical care, but the whispered reality? A whole underground web of quiet reproductive support. Not all monasteries were this helpful. Some burned contraceptive texts, some excommunicated those caught making them, others refused to engage altogether. But history isn't about neat lines. It's about contradictions. And here's the biggest one of all: celibate men preserving contraceptive knowledge for a world they weren't supposed to participate in. You return to the library now. Another monk is asleep at his desk, his hand curled around a quill. On the page, someone has drawn a woman's womb, like a pear with vines. Below it, an inscription: "Within lies both sin and salvation." Well, that's dramatic. Historians still debate how much of this knowledge was used versus just copied. Were monks passing along real-world solutions or just echoing ancient ideas? Did they understand what they were preserving? Maybe not fully, but they preserved it anyway. Joke number 3. Imagine swearing lifelong celibacy, then spending your life writing about other people's sex lives. Welcome to monkhood. You step back out into the night. The wind is cooler now. The abbey looms behind you, all stone and shadow and silent bells. Whatever happened inside those walls, good or bad, left an imprint. And when the time came, when the world moved forward, those scribbled herbs and notes would matter. Because centuries later, when scientists and doctors began rediscovering plant-based contraceptives, they found clues in those old texts. Pages stained with wax, margins full of symbols, recipes that began "take a thimble of rue" and... Monks may have taken vows of silence, but their books never shut up. So next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were all ignorance and darkness, remember this: a monk somewhere, hunched over a candle, wrote the word mugwort a little too carefully and kept history alive. You're walking now through a bustling medieval market just after dawn. The smell of damp straw and hot bread mixes with something far less charming: spoiled meat, sweat, horse droppings. It's not exactly a fragrance you'd bottle, but it's alive. People shout over one another, barter for eels, wave fish in each other's faces like insults. Somewhere a lute plays wildly out of tune. But you're not here for a snack or a serenade. You're here for the medieval pharmacist, the apothecary. Don't picture a clean white coat and soft-spoken man in glasses. Think more along the lines of a chaotic genius surrounded by dusty vials, pickled snakes, ground-up beetles, and the smell of 30 different roots arguing inside one cauldron. Because this is where some of the strangest chemical and mineral-based contraceptive methods took shape. Forget herbs for a moment. Tonight, it's all about alchemy, powders, and some truly questionable ingredients. You duck inside a crooked wooden building where jars line the walls like trophies. Some are labeled with words you can barely read. Others aren't labeled at all, because apparently, who doesn't love a surprise? An old man stands behind the counter. His beard looks like it's trying to escape his face. He grins, revealing 3 whole teeth. "Looking to stop the little ones, are we?" he asks, and you nod. He pulls out a leather-bound book, flips past recipes for plague balm and rat poison, and lands on a page titled, in faded ink, "Charms and Powders to Bar the Womb." Welcome to Chemical Contraception, Medieval Edition. First up, lead-based pessaries. Yep, some women, often the rich ones with access to alchemical medicine, use pessaries made from softened lead or white lead paste, mixed with oils and beeswax. They were shaped and inserted vaginally, intended to block or poison sperm. Here's the obvious catch: lead is horrifically toxic. It damages the nervous system, affects fertility long-term, and was probably responsible for more symptoms than solutions. But they didn't know that. To them, lead was cleansing, heavy, closing, a perfect metaphor for ending fertility. Odd fact time: in some elite Italian households, young women were told to sit upon silver after their weddings, a reference to sitting on metal plates believed to absorb pregnancy-causing spirits. Because obviously, ghosts are real, but anatomy isn't. Your first joke: nothing screams romantic honeymoon like a heavy metal butt plate. Moving on. Another method? Mercury. Yes, the shiny silver liquid we now associate with thermometers. In the 14th century, small doses of mercury were sometimes mixed into elixirs as an internal cleanser. The theory was that if your body got hot enough, nothing could take root, including a baby. Unfortunately, mercury doesn't just kill sperm, it kills everything. It caused vomiting, madness, kidney failure, and worse. Historians still debate whether these mercury potions were used by women regularly or if they were more of an alchemical curiosity. Either way, someone had to test them. You do not want to be that test subject. Over in the Islamic world, where alchemy was more advanced and sometimes less lethal, a different chemical emerged: alum. This naturally occurring compound, used today in pickling and deodorants, was dried and ground into powder, then inserted vaginally with linen. It tightened the tissue, possibly creating a hostile environment for sperm. Does that work? Marginally, maybe. At least it's not mercury. In some Byzantine texts, alum was paired with vinegar-soaked cloths, creating a crude acidic barrier. Modern scientists estimate the acidity of these would probably have killed some sperm, but also irritated everything they touched. Joke number 2. Ah yes, the medieval motto, if it burns, it's working. Back in Europe, another favorite ingredient was saltpeter, better known as potassium nitrate. It was sometimes taken orally in tiny doses and believed to reduce libido or cool the blood. Physicians prescribed it to both men and women seeking to lower their sexual urges and, by extension, avoid pregnancy. Now here's the fun twist. Saltpeter also lowers blood pressure and can cause dizziness or fainting. So the anti-libido part may have just been you being too lightheaded to flirt. The apothecary in front of you now chuckles as he grinds something that smells like burnt leather and old pennies. This, he says proudly, is my special blend. Wormwood, pennyroyal, ground oyster shell, and powdered ant eggs. You pause. Ant eggs? Oh yes, he grins. Very potent. You don't ask questions, you just nod. Let's pause here for an important truth. Almost everything used in medieval chemical contraception came with major risks. These weren't FDA approved. They weren't even kitchen approved. Women took these things out of desperation, secrecy, or trust, and they paid the price. Some survived, some didn't. But every single one of them was trying to take control in a world that wouldn't let them. Joke number 3. When family planning means maybe I won't die from this powdered lizard today, you know it's a rough era. And oh yes, lizards were used too. In parts of North Africa and southern Spain, crushed lizard skin was dried and mixed with copper filings. The resulting powder was sprinkled into cloth tampons or added to drinks. Copper, by the way, does have spermicidal properties. It's part of how modern IUDs work, but no one back then was exactly measuring doses. One Andalusian text even described using powdered bees, yes, actual dead bees, mixed with wine and vinegar. To harden the womb, it said. Historians still debate what that meant, but it definitely sounds like something you'd regret immediately. And finally, we must talk about human urine. Some apothecaries recommended women drink the urine of a virgin boy aged 7 or younger after intercourse. Honest, don't even ask. Just know. Was it effective? Obviously not. Was it horrifying? Absolutely yes. But there's a thread here. People believed that purity, acidity, and foreign energy could counter conception, which led to some stomach-turning recipes and more than a few medical disasters. Yet in all this chaos, one truth remains. Even in places full of poison, people were trying to understand their bodies, trying to create space in their lives, trying somehow to push against the tide of fate. You step out of the apothecary's shop now, blinking in the morning light. The market is louder. A woman nearby holds a screaming chicken upside down. A child drops a loaf of bread and cries. And as you walk past, clutching a pouch that smells like 3 kinds of danger, you realize that medieval people weren't clueless. They were curious, creative, desperate, yes, but determined. They didn't always get it right, but they were reaching for control in a world ruled by chaos. And that, maybe more than anything, is the heart of history. You leave the market behind, the smell of roasted onions and goat cheese clinging to your cloak like a memory you didn't ask for. The path leads you away from the busy cobbles, out past fields dotted with scarecrows and bent-over laborers. It's quieter now. Quieter, but not safer. Because tonight, you're walking into the legal labyrinth of medieval birth control. Yeah, believe it or not, there were laws, sometimes detailed, sometimes vague, and always deeply tangled in religion, superstition, and social control. You might think no one in the 13th century was writing legislation about contraception, but oh no, they were. Sometimes to outlaw it, sometimes to pretend it didn't exist, and sometimes, weirdly, to regulate it just enough to blame someone later. So let's set the stage. You're in a small English village. The year is 1284. A woman named Elsbeth just been dragged in front of a local ecclesiastical court. Those are church-run tribunals that handle, well, moral failings. The accusation? She sold womb-binding herbs to another woman who then failed to produce a child for her husband. The punishment? Public penance, shaming, and the confiscation of her herbal stash. But Elsbeth got lucky. In other regions, the penalty might have been excommunication, or worse, branding. Because in many places, contraception wasn't just frowned upon. It was sinful. And if something was sinful, the church had jurisdiction. You duck behind a column at the back of the makeshift courtroom as a cleric in brown robes begins quoting from Decretum Gratiani, a foundational legal text used throughout Europe. He doesn't use the word contraception, of course. It wasn't coined until centuries later. But he talks about the sin of preventing conception and those who spill the seed without aim. In other words, birth control equals bad. Odd fact time. Some medieval theologians considered using contraception worse than murder because it prevented a soul from entering the world. That's right, ghost babies. Add it to your list of things to fear. Joke number 1. You know it's a party when the legal system is debating how mad God gets if you skip the baby step. But here's where it gets messy. The laws weren't just spiritual. They were deeply gendered. Women, especially those who practiced healing, midwifery, or herbal medicine, were the most likely to be accused of contraceptive crimes. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was just a convenient excuse to control female autonomy. A well-known case from 1322 involves a woman in Cologne who was arrested not for using contraception, but for teaching others how to do it. Her defense? I only told them what their mothers told me. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine oral tradition passed down or a clever dodge to avoid punishment. Either way, she vanished from the records soon after, never a good sign. Meanwhile, in France, things took a stranger turn. Certain forms of birth control were not illegal if used within marriage. Church courts might frown at them, but secular courts often looked the other way. After all, wealthy noblemen didn't want their mistresses getting pregnant either. So, you ended up with this weird double standard where Lady Margot could take pennyroyal in her tea with no issue, but her peasant servant might be flogged for the same. And don't even get started on prostitutes. In many towns, brothels were state-sanctioned, and their workers used all kinds of methods to avoid pregnancy. Vinegar-soaked sponges, wool plugs, herbal tonics. Everyone knew. No one talked about it. As long as the tax revenue came in, the authorities kept their moral outrage on a tight leash. You walk now through a narrow alley between two court buildings, the echo of boots on stone behind you. A parchment is nailed to a door, a sumptuary law, dictating what women can wear based on status. Hidden in the margin, someone scribbled a note, no garlands of rue. Rue, of course, being a well-known contraceptive herb. It's not a ban, it's a hint, a signal. Somewhere, someone's watching. Joke number 2, nothing like a fashion law that also checks your uterus. But the most chilling part of all this wasn't the laws themselves. It was how they were used after the fact. If a nobleman wanted to disinherit a wife, he might accuse her of secretly using contraception to deny him heirs. If a woman miscarried, neighbors might whisper about the tea she drank. If a child was born sick, fingers pointed at the midwife who muttered something under her breath. Midwives especially lived in the crosshairs. They had knowledge, access, and trust, and that made them dangerous. Inquisitors later accused many of them not just of contraception, but of witchcraft. It wasn't a huge leap in logic. She gave me a root and now I'm not pregnant becomes she hexed my womb. And so the line between law, religion, and fear blurred. You enter now the dim interior of a town hall in Bologna, Italy. A copy of the Codex Justinianus sits open on a judge's bench. Within its pages are rules on property, inheritance, and marital duty. If a wife refused her husband's bed, he could petition the court. But if she claimed she took herbs to keep her body clean, she might be accused of fraud or sorcery. Historians still debate how often these laws were enforced. Many seem symbolic, more about control than action. But the message was clear. Reproductive freedom was rebellion. Joke number 3. You know your justice system's a mess when parsley tea counts as a felony. And yet, despite the laws, despite the fear, despite the risk of trial or fire or social ruin, people still did it. They still brewed the tea, still whispered to their daughters, still passed knowledge down in winks and half sentences and coded instructions like only drink this on a waxing moon, or don't let your husband see you soak the cloth. Because even when the world told them no, they carved out quiet, secret yeses. You walk back out into the sun, past the courthouse, past the traders, past the girl selling dried herbs from a basket too neat to be random. She doesn't meet your eye, but she murmurs something as you pass. 3 leaves, steeped, not boiled. You don't ask what, you just nod and keep walking. Because the law can shout, the law can punish, but it can't erase the knowledge written in whispers. You're walking again, your feet crunching over brittle leaves as the forest path curves toward the edge of civilization. Tonight, the world smells like smoke and damp bark, and something earthy lingers in the air, moss, maybe, or secrets. Because now we're headed to the edge of science and magic, where things get blurry, where it's not quite religion, not quite law, not quite medicine. You're about to enter the realm of folk rituals, fertility curses, and contraceptive charms, the Middle Ages' shadowy answer to birth control. Welcome to the mystic zone of medieval contraception. Here, a sprig of yarrow might be more than a wildflower. It might be a spell. A chant spoken backward might be just as important as any herb. A ribbon tied around the left ankle at midnight could be the reason someone's womb stayed shut. Odd fact, in some Slavic regions, it was believed that wearing an amulet made from bat wings wrapped in black cloth would prevent conception if kept under the mattress. And you thought dream catchers were strange. Let's start with charms, those small, carried objects believed to hold power. In villages from Ireland to Hungary, women were given tiny cloth pouches filled with symbolic items, a pinch of salt, a dried worm, a crushed moth's wing. These were sewn into their clothing, often near the belly or thigh. The idea was simple: ward the womb, block pregnancy with symbolic strength. Sometimes it wasn't what you carried, it was what you spoke. You kneel now beside a fire pit, where an old woman stirs a pot of something brown and bubbling. She leans close and mutters a rhyme in Old High German, something about a moon and a child never born. She makes you repeat it 3 times, then presses a finger to your lips. Now don't speak until sunrise, she says. Yes, really. A real contraceptive ritual once required vows of silence because words themselves were thought to have power. Speak wrongly, and you invite fate back in. Joke number 1. Sorry I can't talk. I'm busy not getting pregnant. Across the channel in Cornwall, women sometimes recited rhymes while drinking from hollowed stones believed to have healing properties. One surviving verse reads, "By rock and sea, by wind and rain, no child come through my womb again." No one knows how effective that was, but it's honestly kind of beautiful. Historians still debate how seriously people took these rituals. Were they desperate hopes or deeply held beliefs? Were they spiritual contraception or just superstition? And here's where it gets darker, because alongside the charms came curses. Some intended to prevent birth, some intended to cause it, violently. You find a wax figure buried beneath a tree. Its belly is gouged out, marked with crude symbols. It's a fertility doll, but not a happy one. In parts of medieval Italy and Spain, women believed they could cause sterility in rivals by binding their wombs magically, wrapping cloths around a figurine, piercing the abdomen with pins, or burying it under running water. In Icelandic grimoires, those are magical books filled with runes and spells, there's one charm meant to be carved on whalebone and hidden in a lover's bed. The purpose? To make him infertile, unless the woman consented. Essentially, a magical IUD. Joke number 2. Nothing says healthy relationship like a whalebone curse. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, women sometimes wore belts made of woven horsehair and iron links. These weren't chastity belts. Those are mostly myths, by the way. These were binding belts, spiritual armor, designed to keep unwanted pregnancies or spirits out. They jingled slightly when worn, a soft clinking sound like a warning, I am protected magically and physically. But not every ritual was passive. Some were terrifyingly active. In Eastern Europe, there's a record of women swallowing spider webs mixed with crushed pearls under the new moon. The spider represented entrapment, the pearl, purity. Together, they were believed to seal the womb like a door. Spoiler, pearls don't digest. Don't try that. In some parts of medieval Russia, a woman might walk backward around her house 3 times, then bury her undergarments under the doorstep while whispering a fertility prayer in reverse. If she tripped or said it wrong, tough luck. What's wild is how these practices often overlapped with religion. Some women wore crosses for protection against pregnancy. Others were told that asking the Virgin Mary not to give them a child was sacrilegious, and yet they still asked. You pass a shrine tucked into the woods now, half covered in ivy. Candles flicker below a wooden statue, half Mary, half local goddess, her belly round, her face serene. Women have left buttons, broken needles, pieces of ribbon, small offerings, not asking for a baby, asking not to have one. It's a prayer you don't often hear sung in church. Joke number 3, nothing like asking a saint to keep your bedroom a solo act. One of the strangest practices comes from early medieval Wales. There, women were told to lick the back of a frog, then spit 3 times toward the moon. The frog, as a symbol of fertility, was rejected by the act. That was supposed to prevent conception. Was it symbolic? Probably. Was it effective? Nope. But still, frog, moon, spitting. That's a whole ritual in just 6 seconds. Historians still debate whether these rituals were more psychological than physical. Maybe they calmed the nerves or helped people feel some sense of control in a world filled with chaos, death, and relentless childbirth. Because remember, this wasn't about lifestyle choices. This was about survival. To avoid pregnancy in the Middle Ages was to dodge the very real possibility of death. Every birth was a gamble. Every child another mouth to feed in a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, or enough bread. So if all you had was a chant or a carved stone or a spider web soaked in honey, well, you'd use it, wouldn't you? As the forest grows darker, you find yourself standing in a ring of stones, not quite a circle, not quite natural. Beneath one lies a charm carved into bone, just a single line in Latin, nullis intrat nisi volo. None shall enter unless I will it. It's old, faded, but powerful. Because underneath all the myths, magic, and murmured spells, that's what every woman was really asking for. Choice. The wind sharpens as you step out of the forest and into the shadow of stone walls. A monastery looms ahead, all stern angles and flickering torchlight, its towers piercing the dark like accusing fingers. But tonight, you're not here for prayer. You're here for monks with medicine, nuns with know-how, and the surprising intersection of birth control and medieval monasticism. Yeah, those people you think spent their days copying Bibles and whispering hymns, some of them were also quietly compiling contraceptive recipes and recording the reproductive wisdom of the ages. Because knowledge didn't disappear after the fall of Rome, it just moved into scriptoria, apothecaries, and dusty libraries behind cloistered walls. So welcome to the hush-hush world of monastic medicine, where chastity was law, but contraception was somehow still on the shelf. Let's set the scene. You enter the monastery's infirmary, and the air hits you like a punch of rosemary, lavender, and something sharp and lemony, probably rude. Shelves line the walls, packed with clay pots, dried herbs, bundled roots. A monk in worn robes squints at a parchment, dips a quill into ink, and carefully copies a recipe that includes wild carrot, pennyroyal, and crushed mint seeds. He writes slowly, because he knows this isn't just a tonic. It's a method, a quiet little defense against motherhood. Odd fact, the wild carrot, also known as Queen Anne's lace, was one of the most commonly noted abortifacients in ancient and medieval herbal texts, and some studies suggest it might actually have had mild contraceptive effects. Joke number 1. Nothing says vow of silence like slipping someone a recipe for birth control between psalms. Now you might ask, why were monks and nuns writing this stuff down if they were celibate? Well, for one, they were some of the only literate people in many regions, and they considered medicine part of their charitable work. That meant treating wounds, caring for the sick, and yes, helping women manage pregnancies or prevent them. You thumb through a manuscript in the library. The page is in Latin, but the recipe's clear. To prevent conception, boil a decoction of vervain, rue, and artemisia. Drink daily with wine. That comes from the Trotula texts, a set of medieval medical writings attributed to a female physician in Salerno, Italy. Historians still debate whether Trotula was a real person or a collection of multiple authors, but her work? Legit. She gave detailed contraceptive advice, including herbal mixtures, pessaries, internal sponges soaked in oils, and even postcoital douches made from salt water and vinegar. And here's the kicker. These texts weren't just read by monks. They were studied by medical schools, which means a woman in 12th century France could go to a doctor and get advice pulled from a nun's herbal recipe book. You pass into the convent's garden now, where moonlight glimmers on rows of angelica, mugwort, and silphium. Okay, not silphium. That one's extinct. Rest in peace. Magical Roman plant that allegedly worked so well as birth control they harvested it to death. Seriously. Gone forever. Still, the spirit lingers. Nuns grew what was available, experimented with preparations, and sometimes kept their knowledge off the record. One anonymous nun in 14th century Germany reportedly kept a coded diary of herbal treatments, including contraceptives, meant for use by local women. It was passed hand to hand through generations before vanishing during the 30 Years' War. Joke number 2. Imagine playing medieval telephone with birth control instructions. No wonder someone ended up licking frogs. And yet, the church walked a strange line. Publicly, contraception was condemned. It was a sin, a rejection of God's gift. But privately, some clergy turned a blind eye, especially if the women in question were poor, unmarried, or already had too many mouths to feed. There's even a recorded case of a bishop in Aragon writing to Rome to ask if it was morally permissible to treat women with uterine distress using herbal infusions, knowing full well those herbs would prevent pregnancy. Rome never answered. Historians still debate whether this was hypocrisy, compassion, or quiet realism. After all, monks weren't stupid. They saw the deaths, the malnourished babies, the despair. Sometimes, writing the right recipe was more merciful than quoting scripture. And in convents, things were even more progressive. You pass a nun hunched over a desk, copying a recipe onto linen with dark red ink. She doesn't look up, but she murmurs, "Boil wormwood, juniper berries, and parsley root. Drink before the bleeding ends." You blink, she smiles. For the widow in town, her sixth babe didn't last the winter. She asked for a mercy. That's what they called it sometimes. Mercy recipes, not sin, not rebellion, just survival. And they worked. Not all the time, of course. Most were probably mild, inconsistent, or outright placebos. But some had measurable effects, delaying ovulation, stimulating uterine contractions, or making the womb inhospitable, to use the polite term. Joke number 3. Because nothing says romance like inhospitable womb. You enter a chapel lit by oil lamps, where the stained glass glows in sleepy reds and purples. On the altar, beside the incense burner, sits a single parchment, folded, sealed, and tucked under a candle. You recognize the handwriting. It's the nuns. Another recipe. Another act of quiet resistance. And this wasn't isolated. Monastic hospitals across Europe left scraps of formulas, often unlabeled, sometimes smuggled into religious texts. A Bible with a dried yarrow leaf pressed between psalms. A hymnal with margin notes about when to harvest pennyroyal for full effect. Even in silence, the knowledge spread. That's what makes monastic contraception so strange, so uniquely medieval. It lived in a space between what was forbidden and what was necessary, between faith and function. The monk knew it was against doctrine. The nun knew it defied obedience. But they wrote it down anyway. They whispered it in confession. They brewed it in secret. Because they saw the consequences. They saw the faces. And sometimes, love meant making sure no baby came after. You step back into the hallway and the doors close behind you. Outside, the night feels different, cooler, softer. But under your tunic, you carry a tiny scroll wrapped in cloth. Just a few lines. Ingredients, ratios, instructions. Not a rebellion, not quite, but not nothing either. Just one more recipe in the long, quiet chain of people trying, across centuries, to decide their own future. You're standing at the edge of a field now, but it's not the pastoral dream you might expect. No dew-kissed daisies or peaceful shepherds here. Instead, there's a woman standing barefoot in a clearing, eyes closed, arms raised to the moon. Her lips move in silent chant. Around her, a circle of stones. On the ground, a bundle of herbs, a bowl of water, a small wooden figure carved like a womb. Tonight, you're walking into the tangled, smoke-swirled realm of folk magic and contraceptive rituals, the borderline between science, superstition, and the raw human need to feel in control. Because long before pills, before latex, before anything resembling evidence-based medicine, people were looking to the sky, the stars, and the spirits of the forest to say, "Not tonight, universe." Odd fact, in parts of 14th century Eastern Europe, women believed you could lock the womb by whispering a specific charm while tying 9 knots into a red string, one for each month you wanted to avoid pregnancy. And while you might roll your eyes, here's the thing. For many people, these rituals weren't foolish. They were essential tools, spiritual technologies, passed on when herbs failed and monks looked the other way. Joke number 1. Because nothing says family planning like spellcasting under a full moon with a bowl of goat's milk. Some of the ritual contraceptive practices were surprisingly complex. In parts of what's now Ukraine and Romania, women carried carved stones called matka kameni, literally mother stones, etched with fertility symbols. But here's the twist. To avoid pregnancy, they would bury the stone during their fertile period and dig it up after, a kind of spiritual timeout for the uterus. Historians still debate whether these were meant as literal beliefs or symbolic rituals that gave women psychological agency. But either way, they left their mark. Some of these stones have been found centuries later, with the soil still clinging to their edges. Other customs? In medieval Wales, it was said that walking backward around a hawthorn tree 3 times at midnight, naked, would prevent conception for 1 year. Bonus points if it was during a waning moon and you carried a piece of iron. You imagine trying that today and getting arrested before lap 2. But these weren't just dramatic performances. Many of these rituals had clear logic, even if it doesn't map onto modern science. They created structure, intention, and moments of reflection. They were a way of saying, "This body is mine." One popular charm in the alpine regions was written in animal blood on parchment, rolled into a locket, and worn between the breasts. It read, "May the gates be closed, as were the doors of the ark." Joke number 2. Because nothing says abstinence like biblical flood metaphors. And sometimes these rituals got downright theatrical. In Germanic traditions, women would make womb dolls, tiny cloth effigies representing the unborn child. They'd bless them, swaddle them, and store them in clay pots buried in the home. Then they'd perform a mock funeral, symbolically releasing the spirit of a child they hadn't conceived yet. It was equal parts grief, protection, and prayer. There's something haunting about that, right? But perhaps the most widespread form of magical contraception was spoken spells, verbal incantations timed to cycles, moon phases, or even the first cry of a rooster. One 13th century English charm goes like this: worm and root, stone and flame, close the cradle, stop the name. Say it 3 times before lying with a man, they said, and you'd stay empty as dust. Now, whether these worked, that's hard to prove. Historians still debate whether the effectiveness of these rituals came from actual knowledge, the placebo effect, or just dumb luck. But many involved behavioral cues that probably had indirect contraceptive outcomes, like avoiding sex on certain days or practicing rituals that discouraged intercourse altogether. Because sometimes, spell work was a coded way of saying abstinence during ovulation, even if no one used that word. You walk deeper into the forest now, the moon catching silver on leaves, and see a young woman sitting by a stream, whispering to a string of beads in her hand. She doesn't notice you, but you hear her counting softly. 1 for the seed, 1 for the storm, 2 for the womb that shall stay warm. She drops the beads into the water and lets them float downstream. It's poetic, it's personal, and it's very, very human. Because not every woman in the Middle Ages had access to markets, monks, or medicine. But everyone had words. Everyone had rhythm. Everyone had the urge to do something, even if that meant burying a stone or chanting to the stars. Joke number 3. Honestly, with all this effort, you'd think they'd just invent Netflix and avoid the whole thing. But here's the kicker. Even though the church condemned magic, it didn't stop these practices. In fact, priests often recorded them, not to celebrate, but to warn. That's how we know about many of them today. One inquisitor's manual from the 15th century describes a woman who wore a necklace of teeth from a newborn goat and claimed she hadn't conceived in 10 years. They arrested her, confiscated the necklace. But plot twist, she still didn't get pregnant. Was it luck? Biology? Black magic? We'll never know, and neither did they. But what's fascinating is this. Beneath the fear, the fire and brimstone, and the paranoia, these rituals are still a kind of knowledge. Not scientific, maybe. Not peer-reviewed, but cultural memory, carved into candles, chanted into the sky, and stitched into the lining of skirts. So next time you hear someone say, people back then didn't know anything, remember the woman in the woods, barefoot, whispering to a stone she named after her daughter. She knew enough to try. And sometimes, trying is everything. You walk away now, the sound of frogs rising in the distance, the forest breathing around you. In your hand, a small red cord tied in 9 uneven knots. It might not work, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe, in this strange, starlit world, intentions were a kind of power too. The next part of the path takes you away from cloisters and candles and into something more. Loud, grimy. Honestly, it smells kind of awful. You're standing now at the edge of a medieval market where everything is for sale. Bread, cheese, glass beads, love potions, and surprisingly, contraceptives sold by traveling quacks. Yep. This is the side of history they definitely didn't teach in school. The chaotic world of medieval street medicine, where prevention came with a wink, a lie, and maybe a dead lizard in a bottle. Tonight, you're walking through a place of shouting hawkers, jingling pouches, and someone playing a 3-string lute badly. Over here, a man with a feather in his cap is selling powdered ant eggs, guaranteed to close the womb. Over there, a woman with 1 eye and 17 rings on her fingers is offering a paste that smells like garlic and broken dreams. Let's talk about these vendors. Charlatans, apothecaries, and sometimes actual midwives, peddling what they called ladies' remedies. These weren't always legal, and they weren't always effective. But in a world where doctors were expensive, priests weren't exactly handing out condoms, and most women were desperate for options, well, these shady stalls did a roaring trade. One popular remedy sold in the French countryside, a drink made of wine, grated staghorn, and crushed wasp nest. Odd fact, wasp nests were ground up and used in a surprising number of folk remedies in medieval Europe. Some believed their stinging nature could shock the womb into not conceiving. And no, that's not a euphemism. Joke number 1. Side effects may include confusion, regret, and wasps. Now don't imagine all these concoctions were just fantasy. Some actually had real physiological effects, especially those made with strong herbs like pennyroyal, rue, savin, and tansy. These were sold dried in little paper packets or boiled into tonics. You'd find them labeled with names like Wombbinder, Moon Delay, or the ultra-subtle herbal relief for women's burdens. Pennyroyal, in particular, was everywhere. So much so that even Shakespeare mentions it in The Taming of the Shrew, though not exactly as a contraceptive. Historians still debate whether audiences of the time would have caught the wink. And because regulations were, let's call them relaxed, anyone could claim they had the best potion. Some vendors dressed in mock doctor robes. Others wore bright theatrical clothes and drummed up business with shouts like, "Ladies, does your husband love you, but your womb groans in fear? Come try my cinnamon brew." You stop by one stall where a heavy-set woman is grinding herbs with a pestle the size of a rolling pin. She offers you a sniff. It smells like old socks and lavender. She leans in and whispers, 2 drops under the tongue before lying with your man, and no child will follow. You nod. She winks. You have no idea if she's serious. But that's the point. These treatments walk the line between performance and practicality. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were just sugar water and wishful thinking. But people bought them anyway, because they had nothing else. Joke number 2. I don't know what's in it, but the label says probably fine. And here's a twist. Many of these market vendors were women. They weren't doctors, but they knew their stuff. often midwives or healers who'd learned through experience. They handed down recipes through oral tradition, hiding them from officials or disguising them as cosmetics. Lip balm could be a vaginal pessary. Face tonic might actually be a uterine relaxant. And since midwives were often the only ones helping during childbirth, they were also the first line of defense for women who didn't want to give birth again. In German towns, wise women sold birch bark strips soaked in vinegar that were inserted like tampons before intercourse. Did it work? Maybe. The acidity might have had some mild contraceptive effects, but really it was more about hope in a wrapper. Other weird market offerings? Dried beaver testicles, ground and sprinkled into ale. Don't ask how they got them. Crushed emeralds mixed with goat milk, because nothing says fertility blocker like liquefied bling. Powdered mummified mouse bones. Yes, actual mice. Yes, actual bones. And while these might sound bonkers now, the logic, if you can call it that, was often based on humoral theory. That's the belief that health was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Balance those right and you're healthy. Knock them out of sync, boom, infertility. So something dry and hot, like powdered wormwood, might be used to cool and dry the womb, thus preventing conception. Historians still debate how seriously people took these explanations versus just doing what grandma said worked. You duck behind a stall selling tanned rat skins and look at a merchant with a collection of tiny bottles labeled with Latin abbreviations and question marks. One smells like rotten fruit. Another smells weirdly minty. And sometimes it wasn't even about potions. It was rituals wrapped in commerce. In parts of England and Italy, women bought engraved lead tokens from market stalls, tiny flat discs with protective symbols. They wore them on cords around their waists or stitched them into underwear. These were part contraceptive charm, part fashion accessory. Incredibly, a few have been found in medieval graves. People took their secrets with them. Joke number 3. Wear it near your womb, just don't sit near a magnet. Eventually, town councils and church authorities cracked down on these vendors, not because they were scamming people, though that happened, but because contraception itself was seen as immoral, heretical, and rebellious. Some women were arrested, others fined, some simply vanished, and yet the potions kept selling, quietly, illegally, whispered from mother to daughter, smuggled in herb bundles, buried beneath loaves of bread. Even banned, the knowledge persisted. Because here's the truth: markets might lie, potions might fail, and beaver testicles might be completely useless, but the desire for control over your own body? That's ancient, unstoppable. You leave the market now, the noise fading behind you. You still smell the garlic and mint on your hands. In your pouch, a tiny vial of amber liquid bought from a girl with one eyebrow and too many bracelets. She said it was guaranteed. You smiled and said, "Aren't we all?" And once again, you walk into the night, chasing the strange, stubborn ingenuity of people who would try anything, to keep from having a child they weren't ready for. You wake to the low clatter of hooves against uneven stone, the faint hiss of straw underfoot, and the sound of water boiling over a fire somewhere close. No forest now, no markets. This time, you're in the back room of a medieval bathhouse, tucked behind heavy velvet curtains and thick stone walls. And no, this isn't the spa-like paradise you're picturing. There's no cucumber water, no steam-scented towels. What there is, though, is something far stranger. You're about to watch someone attempt a full-body fertility purge, one of the most intense and obscure birth control rituals of the late Middle Ages. And yes, it involves bathing in wine and lead filings. Let's go slow. In cities like Prague, Florence, and Paris, women, especially those who worked in the unofficial profession of love, turned to medical bathing as contraception. Not because it was relaxing, but because they believed that heat and chemical irritants could close the womb or purge the body of unwanted seed. Tonight, you're crouched behind a changing screen, watching a middle-aged healer pour boiling wine, rosemary, vinegar, and powdered oyster shell into a large wooden tub. Over it hangs a curtain soaked in mugwort and thyme. She calls this a womb steaming tent. Odd fact, medieval bathhouses sometimes used mercury vapors for cleansing rituals, an idea borrowed from Persian and Arabic medical texts. Ironically, these treatments may have actually reduce fertility by destroying your kidneys. Joke number one. Welcome to medieval spa day, now with 100% more organ failure. Your host tonight, a woman named Elfrida, learned the recipe from her grandmother, who learned it from a nun expelled from the convent for herbal disobedience. She claims the bath must be done on a Wednesday during a waxing moon, when Saturn is in a favorable position. Why? No one remembers, but it's in the book. And in this world, the book is law. The woman entering the bath winces at the temperature but stays silent. She's young, maybe 20, and she doesn't seem scared. Just resigned. Like this is something she's done before. And probably will do again. Because that's the truth buried under all this alchemy. Women didn't stop trying. They boiled, scraped, soaked, and steamed their way towards something they couldn't even name: bodily autonomy. One of the strangest ingredients Elfrida uses tonight? A small pouch of lead shavings said to weigh down the womb's hunger. She drops them into the water with a grim look and mutters a prayer. You're not sure if she's praying to God or just hoping nobody dies. Lead, of course, is toxic, but back then it was used in face creams, contraceptives, and hair tonics. The idea was that if it dried out your skin, it could also dry out your fertility. Historians still debate whether these concoctions were designed to terminate pregnancy or simply to prevent implantation. In modern terms, they might have had abortifacient qualities, though that line was blurry, and no one was charting hormones in 1387. Now here's where it gets weird. After the bath, Elfrida applies a thick gray paste made from burnt fig bark, cow bile, and goose fat to the woman's abdomen. It smells like a medieval garbage bin, but she swears it draws out the seed. The woman lies still, her eyes closed. She doesn't speak for a long time. Joke number two. Smells like no babies and bad decisions. Unless you think this is just one strange lady in one strange house. These kinds of treatments were surprisingly widespread. In fact, municipal records from London and Milan mention bathhouses that quietly offered ladies' cleansing rituals on Fridays, with herbs supplied under the table by retired midwives. Some even offered packages, steam, massage poultices, and a contraceptive tonic on the way out. Kind of like a medieval Groupon, but with more nettles. You'd find recipes hidden in cookbooks, margin notes, and even scrawled on the backs of religious texts. Why? Because women hid knowledge wherever they could, and paper was precious. Joke number three. Nothing says spiritual enlightenment like contraceptive tea in a Bible. Now, as the woman in the bathhouse dresses and prepares to leave, Elfrida gives her one final thing, a tiny coin with an owl carved into it. She says it will watch the womb and should be worn on a belt. Superstition? Maybe. But it's also comfort. And isn't that half the point? Because here's what this whole story has been leading to. Not just weird facts and ancient techniques, but something deeper. You've seen the lizard fat pessaries, the spells carved in wood, the wasp nest powder, and the knot tying rituals. You've followed women into forests, bathhouses, altars, markets, and back again. And through it all, one truth echoes loud. They wanted control. They were desperate to carve space between themselves and the crushing weight of biology, religion, patriarchy, and chance. And they did it with whatever they could find: herbs, heat, lead, silence, even fear. Historians still debate the efficacy of these methods, but no one doubts the intent. That desire to choose when and whether to become a mother is older than any calendar or castle. So as you leave the bathhouse tonight, the warm air following you into the cobbled street, you realize you're not just walking through a forgotten chapter of medical history. You're walking through resistance, quiet, steaming, stubborn resistance. You pause beneath a hanging lantern, its oil sputtering low, and remember all the strange things you've seen. Crocodile dung and linen, fox testicle amulets, honey vinegar pessaries, boiled wine baths, prayers in knot form, and whispered spells on the edge of midnight. This was their arsenal, their hope, their science. And as the night deepens, you understand, maybe for the first time, how much power there is in the trying. Closing section. And now, slow down. Let the story drift from your mind like steam from the bathhouse walls. The voices fade. The herbs lose their sting. The forest hushes. You are lying in the dark now, warm and still. And all the strange old things you've seen tonight settle behind your eyes like leaves on a quiet pond. No more vinegar or magic stones. No more whispered charms or molten lid. Only the quiet bravery of women whose names were never recorded, their knowledge passed down like secret songs. In the soft hum of your room, you can almost hear them. The woman crushing herbs by candlelight, the girl knotting red thread behind a curtain, the midwife burying a doll beside a stream. None of them knew if it would work, but they did it anyway, because choice in any form is sacred. This wasn't a history of kings or wars or monuments. It was a history of resistance, of hands, whispers, and cleverness, of saying, not this time. Let your breath slow now. Let your thoughts stretch like old linen in the sun. The story is done, but it's still with you, quiet, steady, and strange. So drift easy wherever you are in the world. Someone else has walked this path before. Someone has always tried. End of script. Good night.